Okay, I know we have people who are still joining, so we're going to wait one more sec. Also, Joseph stepped out for a second, so once he's back in frame, we'll probably dive into introducing ourselves and giving you all a rundown of why it is that I am so excited to talk about Arts to Explore, Privilege, Power, and the Paradox of Voluntourism with Joseph Chia and Leigh Mathews. Okay, so I have just posted as well the discount code and link for 40% off in the chat, which will also be sent out later. That is buying directly from my publisher, Potomac Books, which is an imprint of the University of Nebraska Press. But it's 8:06 my time. I know that there's people from all around the world joining in. And so why don't we dive in? I'm actually going to introduce myself last. I'd love if Joseph could start.
Okay. Good morning, everybody, and hi. Firstly, congratulations to Pippa. What a fantastic book. I've had the privilege of reading it, and I've read it twice. And in readiness for this morning, I had a look at it again last night. Thank you also to Leigh, who's organised all of the technical aspects of this. But I firstly introduce myself. My name is Joseph Chia. I'm based in Japan. So for me, it's about 9 a.m., just after 9 a.m. this morning. So it's a very civilized time. Thank you, Pippa and Leigh, for doing that. I'm a professor in sustainable tourism here at Wakayama University in Japan, in Western Japan. And a lot of my work is around trying to inquire into how tourism can be produce better outcomes for everyone. And it's the nature of the book that Pippa's just published as well. But the connection between Leigh and Pippa and I is this book. Now, at book launches, we always wave books around, right? So, so this book was published about a year ago, and Leigh and I and a couple of others, Kate Van Dor and Karen Flanagan, were editors. And also featured on the first page is Miss Pippa Biddle herself, who contributed a chapter on her work. So I'm very privileged to be a part of this. I congratulate you, Pippa, and I thank everybody for coming. I see some colleagues of mine from Japan and Australia, and there's even a colleague of mine from Fiji, Stephen Pratt. So Bula, Stephen, and thanks for coming. So I hand over to you, Leigh. Next.
Thanks, Joseph. Again, I'd like to echo your congratulations to Pippa. I know that this has been a long road to get to today, and you've put so much work into this book, and it's excellent. And like Joseph, I've had 2 reads and a third skim very early this morning in preparation for today. But how do we know each other? Well, actually, I'll step back a bit. I'm Leigh Mathews. I am, as Joseph said, one of the co-authors and contributors to the Modern Slavery and Orphanage Tourism book. And I'm a consultant and activist, practitioner in the international child protection sector. A lot of my work intersects with tourism, particularly around orphanage tourism. And a large part of my work over the past 5 years or so has been working directly with major tourism operators to help them divest from their engagement with orphanage tourism, but more broadly with more unethical forms of tourism. I am one of the founders of, or co-founders of, Rethink Orphanages Network, which aims to end the unnecessary institutionalization of children. And that is how I know both Pippa and Joseph, through our work with Rethink Orphanages. And this has turned into a long and ongoing relationship with both Pippa and Joseph through our work. And I'm really pleased to be continuing it through this today.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much. And I'll be talking obviously throughout the next hour about the book. My name is Pippa Biddle. If you did not know that, it's written on the cover of this book that ostensibly I have written. And I'm very grateful, honestly, for the role that both Joseph and Leigh have played in this. Joseph was one of my reviewers for it early on, who was able to provide really, really critical feedback. I aspired to write a book that, to be entirely honest, when I ideated at 22, was far beyond what I was capable of doing at 22. And so it has been a fascinating journey over the past really 6 years to not just learn more about volunteerism, but also learn how to learn about volunteerism and how to explore a subject that is complicated, that is far from clear cut, far from black and white, and that carries a lot of emotion with it and a lot of difficult conversations. And Leigh was kind enough to let me write about her, which is not something I take lightly. Leigh is featured in the book as someone who is really pushing the industry in a better direction, and challenging some of the biggest struggles that happen in volunteerism. And the fact that she let me represent her on paper, I really, really, really appreciate. So I'm excited to dive in and sort of explore more about what Ours to Explore is, and what are the sort of big questions that the book tries to struggle with the perspective of Leigh and Joseph really rounding out and challenging my own perspective on these issues. So I have it on my agenda that Joseph's going to ask me, how did this book come about? I feel like I can just jump into that. Yeah. The book came about because I wrote a piece in 2014 that really was the rant of a frustrated 22-year-old with a blog. We all know that person. I was that person. And I wrote it without a ton of thought about what I was writing, except for that I was feeling very, very strongly about experiences that I'd had in high school doing volunteerism. And volunteerism, as I define it, is any combination of volunteering and tourism. I tend to leave things like the Peace Corps out of my volunteerism critique, although there's huge amounts of overlap. The Peace Corps being the United States version of very long-term volunteering in a country outside of your own. For me, volunteerism is typically 4 weeks or less, quite often involves working with children. That's the most popular form of it. And it's mostly done by people with privilege in places that are less privileged than the person who's doing the activity. Most volunteerists are white. So race is undoubtedly a player in the global volunteerism conversation. And while volunteerism is a small part of the multi-trillion-dollar tourism industry, it itself being a multi-billion-dollar industry, it's been lauded as the future of travel by not just the industry itself, but also by governments in the UN. And anytime something is being called the future of a trillion-dollar industry, it requires close examination. Just that alone is a reason to examine it. But for me, what I'd found as a volunteerist myself was that there was a really extreme mismatch between what I aspired to do, which was to change the world and to improve people's lives and to find a greater sense of who I was all at the same time in a 2-week period, and also see some baby lions. And what actually happened, which was that I learned while on the ground that I wasn't very good at what I was supposed to be doing. I, in fact, was entirely unqualified to be doing it and was causing a lot of harm along the way. It wasn't until much later that I learned actually the depths of the harm that I was causing. So Joseph held up the Orphanage, Tourism, and Modern Day Slavery book that we worked on. And when I first wrote a blog post in 2014, I actually did not even know that the fact I was in an orphanage was a key problem. I thought the fact I didn't know how to lay a brick was the biggest problem. And so over the past 6 years, I've really learned a lot about how voluntourism is not a new thing. We've been doing it for as long as mass tourism has existed. It is birthed from colonialism. It is a product of colonialism. It could only exist with colonialism. And in many ways, it is a form of contemporary colonialism. It is a continuation of a exercise of supremacy carried out by 17-year-olds with really, really good intentions. And for me, that is really the most interesting part. I probably still wouldn't be interested in this if intention wasn't so good. If people didn't genuinely want to help, it'd be pretty uninteresting. If this was a bunch of evil doing Westerners trying to destroy the world under the ruse of doing good, that'd be interesting for a bit, but eventually you'd sort of get a bit old. What's fascinating to me is that we actually want to do good. And I think Joseph, Leigh, and myself all enter this conversation as people who've wanted to do good and realized, wait, what does good actually look like? And what does good actually mean? And how are we failing at that? And so I'm really excited to sort of dive into that specifically, especially that the role of intention and how intention has so often led us astray when it comes to international development. And that's a key part of this as well, is that voluntourism is a form of international development. Has it worked as a form of development? No. But have many of the things we've tried for international development worked? Also no. So it's not unique in its failures. It's not unique in what is alluring about it. It's really a symptom of how we treat the world. And to me, it's an opportunity to, looking at voluntourism as an opportunity to gain greater understanding of where we have flaws as humans, where we continue to repeat patterns that create harm, and how we can shift ourselves out of those patterns and towards what I hope to be really like a better future. So I'd love to sort of dive in, Leigh, if you have a question for us to start on, to sort of dig into voluntourism as a subject, and I'll be ranting about the book, but also your guys' perspectives on what's going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, in that introduction, you covered so many aspects that are really, really important to dive deeper into here. But the one that's probably closest to my area of interest and the work I'm doing currently is this idea of why. Why do we have this drive to do good, and how does it manifest, and what are the harms that come from this kind of blind drive to be engaged in doing good? And in your book, there's a section in there on pathological altruism, and it's certainly something that arises a lot when we're looking at particularly the orphanages space. And the line in your book is that people push forward as messiahs of development in the face of evidence that contradicts their intent. So this is a classic feature of people that are volunteering in orphanages, that are confronted with the information, the facts that this is harmful, you know, this causes damage to children's development, that damage is lifelong and can be intergenerational. And they turn around and they say, no, not my orphanage. My orphanage is a good orphanage, and I'm a good person, so I couldn't possibly be causing harm. I'm interested to understand your perspectives on pathological altruism and how that kind of drives this as an industry.
Yeah, I think that pathological altruism is such a useful term because it allows us to, my sister's on this call, so she's going to check me on this, but I'm going to use the word that's probably not a word, psychologize a human, what appears to be a human behavior. But I think that's something that's really interesting, that's especially prevalent in Western societies, which is where volunteerism is also most prevalent, is this concept of exceptionalism. We think of ourselves as lone actors, that we are capable of operating not just like parallel to, but entirely separate from the trends and realities of the whole. And so we're uniquely able to see things go wrong and to see even our own actions result in negative consequences, and yet to also rationalize the continuation of the same activities and the same actions and the digging in, because we see ourselves as exceptional. And by exceptional, I don't mean like astounding A+ gold star. I mean really as an exception to the norms that are going on around us. And I think what you mentioned in your question was the concept of the good orphanage, the concept of the individual saying, but I'm doing it differently. And this is something that, I mean, Leigh and I were speaking at an event a number of years ago, and I spoke for about 30 minutes and she spoke for about 30 minutes. So it was a good hour of content about how orphanages are horrific places that should not exist. And a gentleman in the audience basically said, look, I hear you and I believe you and I agree with everything you're saying, but I need to explain to you why the orphanage that I volunteer at is different. And it was just astonishing to me because it was such a perfect example of pathological altruism, such an example of the concept of exceptionalism, of being able to be presented with all of this evidence and yet to see yourself as different. And that's something I even found with, when I first started writing about volunteerism and started publishing pieces, I actually stopped publishing short pieces about volunteerism predominantly because they were being co-opted by trip providers who used them as evidence of how they were different. They'd say, oh, look, Pippa did not specifically say that we are bad, so we must be good. And to me, that is just such an astonishing fault in logic, but it's also fascinating because it again speaks to intention. It speaks to the idea of this, an intention to do good that is so powerful that it completely overrides all evidence. And when you see that happening over and over and over again across millions of people for now over 150 years, you have to think that it has something to do with our human psyche. It's not a fluke. It's not singular lone actors who don't know better. And shifting the way that humans think and the way that we behave is not an easy ask. But I'd like to think that we are at a point in our development as a global community where we can do better. And that's a really important, David Sprules, I'm going to ask you to mute yourself, but I care about you very much. But that is a really important thing, I think, for us to consider as we explore volunteerism, is this idea of people thinking of themselves as exceptions, and pathological altruism really like underlying that and holding it up.
Yeah, absolutely. That, I guess we've touched on orphanage tourism in that conversation, and I'm obviously a large part of my work is looking at how global child protection issues intersect and overlap in the tourism sector in general, but in particular, my interest certainly started with volunteerism, and I think it's you know, the orphanage tourism issue is one that certainly got a lot of traction over the past few years, and a lot of that is for the very same reasons why volunteering in orphanages gets a lot of traction. It's because we're talking about vulnerable children, and we know that talking about and pictures of and stories of vulnerable children engages people. That's why they go and volunteer in orphanages in the first place. And we've been able to, I guess, use that to stimulate conversation about why they shouldn't, and share stories from the other perspective. But tourism as a whole actually intersects with the issue of child protection and safeguarding. And I think that's something that the wider sector is starting to grapple with. It. This isn't just about orphanage tourism. This is how the sector itself presents vulnerable communities in destinations and offers products to engage with them. And so we're seeing a shift away from, you know, the dirty word of volunteerism to things like community-based tourism, or, you know, social good tourism, where you're not necessarily volunteering, but you're still engaging with social causes. I'm interested to know what you think of that shift.
I'm actually going to bounce this to Joseph first, because I think that he has some really interesting stuff to share around literally the global perspective on tourism outside of just the volunteerism industry, and how all these things bleed together.
Okay, thanks, Pippa. Yeah, it's a challenging question, because for all of the imperfections that global tourism has, it also does do some positive things in some communities, right? So we have this kind of, you know, it's a dilemma, you know, damned if you do and damned if you don't, to some degree, in tourism as a whole. And my students often say, after sitting in my classes, they can never enjoy holiday again, right? They can never lie on the beach again comfortably without thinking of their impact and, you know, and the flow-on effects of the dollar they spend. So I think, you know, to try and simplify tourism as being either good or bad and as a binary is really problematic, because it's not perfect. But in some countries, for example, you know, in the global south, for many countries, the drop-off of tourism because of the pandemic has created significant economic and social issues. It has spotlighted how important tourism is in an economic sense, right? But of course, we know that a community is not just its economy. You know, a community is more than an economy. A country is more than an economy. So when we talk about tourism as we see it now, and Leigh and I wrote a paper in The Conversation some years ago, where we talked about the collision between modern slavery and tourism. You know, when we are on a beach in Bali, or when we get a massage in Thailand, you know, if we consider the supply chain behind all of the experiences we have, you know, much like, you know, if we consider the supply chain behind textiles or the horticultural supply chain, you know, what we see in the supermarket belies what goes on behind the scenes, right? And our supply chains beyond tourism are rife with breaches of labor rights, are rife with modern slavery, are rife with environmental and ecological concerns. So a book like yours, Pippa, problematizes something that we would like to think is benign, that we would like to think is on balance is more positive than it isn't. So you made a very important point that when we try, you know, we can't discourage the attempts for people wanting to do good, right? And Leigh has written a lot about this. You know, doing good has to have some credit, but it also needs to be moderated and channeled so that it sets out to do exactly what it achieves. So for all of us sitting in the audience, and there's an international audience there, we love to travel, right? And in a paper I wrote in a journal at the University of California, Current History, where we talked about the historical legacies of tourism in developing countries. And Pippa is right. You know, the links to colonialism are very strong. You know, the extent to which the global economy and capitalism itself extracts from communities can't be denied. But in problematizing all of this, we can't discourage people from wanting to do good, from wanting to contribute to making the world a better place. You know, and I was thinking about this last night when Bob Geldof had that major thing against poverty and starvation in Ethiopia. That was over 20 or 30 years ago, right? You know, and the song, what was the song?
Yeah, Radiate. Or not, sorry, not Radiate. Oh, geez, what's it called? I had a whole section of it in the book. Live Aid?
Band-Aid.
Band-Aid.
Right?
Yeah.
Or all that kind of, but that was several
Thank
decades.
you, Yam.
But that was several decades ago, right? And we're still grappling with the same issues now. I mean, one of the questions that I have for people here about voluntourism is that, you know, we see the role that faith and gender plays in this. It's a very gendered thing. When you look at volunteer tourism, and one of the contributors to our book, Chloe Sanguinetti, the filmmaker of the film The Voluntourist, if you haven't seen it, go to Google and search for it. It spotlights really clearly many of the things that Pippa talks about. So there are no clear answers. You know, when we discuss it, enough, my students say, well, we know tourism is a problem, but how do we solve this? And in your book, Pippa, you say this. Here are the problems. The solutions are many and varied. So travel and the footprint we leave behind is a massive thing. And the voluntourism is just one microcosm of this kind of dynamic of host and guest. You know, as a guest in someone else's place, do we consider the impact we have? But anyway, Leigh, I'll hand it to you, Leigh, to extend that discussion.
Yeah, as you're talking, Joseph, lots of things are coming up, and I think you used the word extractive, and I think that's a really good word to use when we're talking about volunteerism. Not so much the individual volunteerist themselves, but the companies or the industry that is behind this. And I think there's extraction on both sides. There's extraction of money from tourists and their good intentions. And there's extraction from vulnerable communities, from profit. And then there's extraction by the traveler themselves as they are having their experience volunteering. And, you know, I guess my focus initially when I started this work was we have to tell everybody, and we have to get everybody to change their behavior and stop doing orphanage tourism. And over time, it became clearer and clearer that actually we need to change the products that are on offer from these companies. We need to change how they approach vulnerable communities. We need to challenge this idea that they see themselves as development organizations, when in reality, they do not practice development as we understand it as a development professional. They do not collect data. They do not measure impact, yet they report on all of the impacts that they're having. And I think it's really important to clarify, and I do this when I'm speaking to these companies, is that impact is not the number of wells you built or the schools you constructed or the bags of rice you distributed. Impact is measured over time, and it's outputs plus, you know, outcomes equals impact. And not a single one of these companies that have squarely positioned themselves in the development sector and are channeling a lot of money into that sector, not a single one of them have demonstrated any kind of impact measurement to show the impact that the presence of their volunteers is having on development issues in local communities. And I think that's really, really telling, is that you cannot position yourself as a development actor if you are not able to provide evidence for the interventions you're saying you're achieving. And that's really challenging for the sector itself to think about. And often when you talk about this, they will say, well, come up with a solution. How do we solve this? How do we do better at this? And the reality when they're confronted with it is that this is an inherently flawed business model that is extractive and is exploitative. And to really turn it around, you have to stop what you're doing and completely change your approach to how you think about engaging with communities and how you think about travel. And to me, that's probably one of the biggest challenges in this space, is actually the acknowledgement that volunteerism itself is a flawed business model. And how do you come back from that?
I think that's absolutely key to this is, again, remembering volunteerism is a business. So often I use the term trip provider to refer to people who offer volunteerism products, but I even catch myself still saying organization often. And in the United States, there are for-profit trip providers who call themselves organizations, and that is entirely legal. They can have a .org domain. A lot of people think that having a .org domain name means that something is a nonprofit. Now, being a nonprofit does not make you any more ethical of a trip provider, but it does help us remember when we think about it as an industry, that this is an industry with products and with customers. And the customers are not the communities. The customers are the travelers who are buying this tourism product. And it was really interesting listening to Joseph talk about travel and how we're not about to stop traveling. One of the things that's been fascinating for me is that the more I've studied volunteerism, the less I've traveled. And it's not because I don't want to travel. I miss it a lot. It's because I myself have struggled with feeling crippled by how to travel better. With what I know now, how can I actually make the decisions to go to the right places? And I feel very bad for my husband. It's our second anniversary today, because our honeymoon planning was hell. Because just about every idea that was presented to us, I had some moral qualm with, something that made me uncomfortable around it. I would love to be able to go back in many, many ways to the sort of like free floating happiness of buying a few days at an all-inclusive and not thinking twice about it, because it was a ton of fun to drink endless rum punch on the beach. But the more that I've learned about the extraction that comes with mass tourism, the more complicated it's been to buy into these products. But I also understand that my own willingness to slow down the amount that I travel to allow for traveling better. And by traveling better, I mean focusing on staying in places that are locally owned, eating at places that are locally owned, having tour guides who are local, is really focusing on investing in the local economy and making sure that my dollars stay there, means that I travel less. Everything that we do has unforeseen consequences. Some of those consequences are easier to see than others. In volunteerism, we can see the consequences firsthand if we look closely enough. That's one of the reasons why it's interesting to study, is because it's possible to see that. But it also allows us to look into global tourism as a whole, and the fact that we are taking part, whenever we go anywhere outside of our own community, in a system that is not designed to help the people where we go. But as Joseph pointed out, many economies have developed to the point where they do rely on it. And it is an important aspect of that economy. So simply not going somewhere ever again is also not the option that I think any of us should be taking. So to Leigh's point, there's really nothing we can do as travelers except challenge the industry while simultaneously trying to make better decisions ourselves. And for me, one of the first ways to make better decisions is actually to stop doing the thing that for decades we've been calling the better decision. We've been calling volunteerism and alternative tourism and service-based travel and whatever package that we wrap it up in, the better form of tourism, whereas that's actually a false product. It's a product, and it's greenwashing, and it's completely designed to lure people into the idea that they can buy something and go somewhere and not feel guilty. And in fact, what that product is so much more rotten often than when I used to sit on the beach at an all-inclusive and drink endless rum punches, which in some ways I find optimistic, because, hey, there's more rum punch in my future.
Pippa, if I may just touch on what you said, when we think about travel and volunteer tourism in particular, It's the commodification of poverty, right? It's a marketing vehicle to sell us an experience. And tourism, to some degree, is that. The volunteer tourism takes it next level. You know, and it reminds me of one of the people that Leigh has been working with, Professor Peter Singer at Princeton. He talks about affective altruism, right? Where it makes us feel good to give someone with a cup out on the street a couple of dollars, right? But whether that's doing more good than harm is a question we need to ask ourselves, because it's about system change rather than working at the edges, trying to make small contributions that make us feel good. You know, and this is the question with volunteer tourism, as Pippa has touched on. How do we encourage system change rather than mindless consumption of travel? And the way we consume travel is really the way we consume generally. You know, there's this emphasis on more. This emphasis on this constantly becoming responsive to the marketing of our daily lives. Every inch of our lives is marketed, and travel is just one symptom of that. So how do we make system changes rather than just work at the edges is the issue.
Joseph, that's a really good point, and something I wanted to touch on as well, and the book does too, is this idea of the white savior industrial complex. And when we talk about systems in doing good, we cannot ignore that complex is an inherent part of it. And that's the network of businesses and nonprofits that support and encourage people to execute their doing good, which is based in their privilege-based assumptions about what is good. And so, you know, I think there's a lot that has gone into challenging the white savior industrial complex, particularly over the past few years. And it's very, very late in time for that conversation to be had, but it's happening. But you know, there's two different questions here. There's the question of individual saviorism, or doing good blindly without thinking about the consequences. And then there's the system behind us that allows us to engage in doing good. And this is where these for-profit not organizations, let's use the word companies, for-profit companies sit. They sit in that space of that system, which enables us to think we're doing good without having the need to dig any deeper and understand if we're really doing good. We blindly trust these companies with their shiny marketing about how much your child is going to grow as a leader when they head off and do a 2-week missions trip. We blindly trust companies that promise to give a percentage of their money to charity when we buy a pair of shoes online. We think that they're doing the work, that they understand the issues, that they're solving them, they're measuring impact, but actually they're not. And that's where it comes back to this individual responsibility to do better at doing good, to make better decisions, to learn more, and not just blindly trust that because someone positions themselves in the doing good space that they're actually good. And that's the biggest kind of takeaway for me around this volunteerism sector, is that people are trying to find an outlet for their desire to do good and to help. And these companies have popped up to fill that vacuum and make it very, very simple for you to choose where you want to go and what you want to do at what time.
Yeah, and I think to Leigh brought up the white savior industrial complex. It's something I read about in the book. It is a term that can cause a lot of people to prickle a little bit and to sort of hedgehog. And I understand why, because I get how having an individual's race, or I think actually privilege, white and savior industrial complex is not solely about whiteness, it's about privilege. Having someone's privilege pointed out is an extraordinarily uncomfortable experience. But again, this links us back to this idea of exceptionalism. When we talk about the white savior industrial complex and people respond by saying, but it's not my fault, that is in fact taking an exceptionalist lens, looking at it as the individual and saying me about something that's actually a system. And when we are so intent on sort of personalizing and making about me, when we're trying to dismantle and gain better understanding and redirect a system, we lose all power and control. We lose all forward momentum. We get completely bogged down in this individualist mindset that is so central to the harm that we're creating on a global scale, rather than understanding that by looking at it as a system, by sort of removing the individual from it and thinking about it as this global system of privilege and whiteness for centuries, extracting things from communities, exacting harm upon communities for their own ends, that's actually sort of an empowering thing to do, because all of a sudden, it's not about the individual, it's about what we can do collectively. It's about how collectively we can shift the way that we engage with communities. We can shift the way that we try to help people. And to me, that is actually like far more powerful than the power of the individual. And I think that's been one of the things for me throughout the book and throughout writing the book and promoting the book and trying to explain the book is the book tells individual people's stories. There's individual people who are featured in the book, but voluntourism is not about individuals. It's about a global system. It's about a global industry that is exacting something upon communities that's causing harm. And I want to make sure that we have time to jump into the questions. We have some questions coming in. The first one is from Eileen Schleff and is around measuring impact in the long term. I'm going to let Leigh take this because Leigh is like queen of impact, and anything that is about impact and measuring impact in the book, I stole from her.
Thanks, Pippa. Look, the idea of measuring impact is standard and accepted in the development sector, and we've developed systems to do it. I don't want to say well, because there's such a spectrum of how impact is measured and reported on that is a whole nother webinar in itself. But the volunteerism sector, or the companies that operate within it, in my experience, haven't got the internal technical development experience or knowledge to even develop systems to think about measuring impact in this way. And there are a few different ways to look at measuring impact, particularly around volunteerism. And Joseph and I have had many a meeting trying to strategize how we solve this problem, because we have mechanisms for measuring the impact of a development project. We know how to do that. We have mechanisms for measuring the impact of a trip on the travelers themselves, so a volunteer trip. So if we think about it in the context of schools, we can say, okay, here's how they felt before they left, here's what they learned, and here's how they felt about it after. And these are the changes that they self-reported within themselves. In that space, we don't see a lot of longitudinal evidence that going on a volunteerism trip actually changes a young person for the better. In fact, to my knowledge, there's very few studies that have longitudinally measured the impact of going on a 3-week Year 9 high school service trip and how that changes, your decisions around engaging in doing good or your career choices. We haven't really seen that, but we can measure it in the short term. What we can't measure is if you have an existing development project and then you bring in a group of volunteers, what we're not seeing measured is the impact of that group over that very short period of time on a development project that might be going for years. So what we see happen, because that can't be measured, what we see happen is the volunteerism company will claim the whole project and they'll say, we did this, when actually they might have been there for 2 weeks at a time over a certain period of months repeatedly. But there's this whole other set of work going on in the background by a local organisation, for example, and that work is not being acknowledged. It's being claimed by the organisation. So I think there's a real challenge there in how we measure, but there has to be a willingness for volunteerism companies to actually want to measure, because I don't think they'll like what they find if they are measuring.
Yeah, I think parallel with that, one of the big challenges that we've seen with the certification of trip providers in voluntourism and alternative tourism as more ethical, there are all these sort of certificates and badges and membership organizations that have been created to sort of say, oh, but we're different, we do good. Oftentimes, one of the bullet points for getting that badge or certification is showing impact. But when you actually look at the annual reports for those organizations and for-profits, what they are calling impacts are actually either, as Leigh spoke to, individual projects on the ground that are inputs, like building a school, not impacts, like the long-term results of having built that school, or they're claiming the positive experiences of the voluntourist as a impact.
Yeah.
Now, I am the first to admit that I am a better person because of the experiences that I have had through volunteerism. That is, in fact, one of the most complicated parts of the volunteerism industry. I was very, very lucky to be able to take part in activities that challenged me, that pushed me, that made me see the world differently and more broadly, and to have a more global perspective at a young age, to then return to my community and have my community celebrate me for having done that. And then a decade later, to be able to denounce what I did when I was 16 and 17 years old and have a different community celebrate me for doing that and let me write a book about it. And that is extraordinarily twisted. It is unavoidable that there is an entire sort of centering of myself being a symbol sort of what millions of volunteerists are experiencing in that experience. And this is something that was really interesting speaking to my parents over many years about my experiences in volunteerism. Was for a long time, they would argue, but look what you got from it, look what you got from it, look what you got from it. And for me, a really watershed moment was when their thought shifted and they started to say, look what harm it could have done. And that shift was really, really critical. And that's a shift I'm hoping more of us can have and really encourage others to have, is to realize it's not about what we as individuals get from it. It's about the harm that's potentially being done in order for someone who's already privileged, who already has so much, to gain a broader worldview. We have another question, which I think is really, really interesting, from Liz Fanning around international NGOs and whether it's ethical for them to bring donors to the villages where they work so they can see their impact on the ground and hopefully donate more, which is so complicated. I'm going to give my quick 2 cents on it, and I'd love to hear what Joseph and Leigh think, because it's quite possible that we disagree. I think that on the ground organizational visits can be very interesting and impactful. And I've taken part in them and facilitated them for other people with very, very clear boundaries. You do not interact with children. You do not get to pay for access or pay to play with vulnerable people. You learn about the organization. That means often visiting offices, touring buildings when there's no one in them, listening to really fairly boring and dry PowerPoints that you could have watched over Zoom. But unfortunately, the things that donors most want are the things that I'd like to see stripped from the experience, which is the performative aspect of a community being put on show to exert some sort of or extract some sort of monetary gain.
Okay, I'll add to that, Pippa. And this question is related to the previous one about impact, right? Because very often we look at impact in economic terms, not realizing that, you know, there's more to life than just the economics of things. But on the topic of donors want to see, donors need to report back to their stakeholders, right? And that's a necessary part of the role they play. They want to see the fruits of their labor, but they also come with an agenda. You know, donors have an agenda, whether they be countries as donors or whether they be faith-based group as donors. There is an underlying purpose for what they do, as you say in your book, Pippa. You know, talking about faith, purpose, and mission. This is kind of all entangled, and trying to disentangle that is a very difficult thing. But it made me think about how this is the kind of spectacularization of poverty. You know, it becomes this kind of, you know, thing of entertainment rather than education. It becomes a vehicle for the promotion of the donors and the work they do, rather than the privileging of the recipients of the work that they have. And it's all enmeshed in this kind of idea to constantly spotlight and promote how well you're doing poverty. You know, it becomes a competition for how well you're doing poverty. So I'm afraid there's this complex web of things going on when, you know, and everybody wants to have a stage upon which they promote themselves. So, you know, at an individual level, it's Instagram, you know, people volunteering and taking photos of children in their arms and look at this fantastic, hut we built. And my friend, Mary Mostafanejad, who's the co-editor of a journal that I edit, she writes about celebrity humanitarianism, right? And at a very low level, as individuals, we look at these celebrities performing humanitarianism, and we want to do the same thing. And this idea of performing humanitarianism is troubling, right? Because we would, you know, in an ideal world, we would like people to do good without wanting the kudos and the fame that comes with it. But that's perhaps naive of me to think that, which then segues nicely to you, Leigh.
Yeah, I'm probably going to offer a bit of a different perspective here. I think we need to look at this through the lens of decolonizing development, and think about the why. Why do they need to come and visit? What is the motivation? And that touches on what you were just saying, Joseph, is that there's a privilege in being a donor, right? There's a social status. I'm a good person who donates, and I have the capacity to go and visit the people in these far off places that I donate to. But as the organization facilitating that work and I guess running that tricky road between managing donor expectations and trying to deliver quality and ethical projects on the ground, it can be really difficult to do that. And, you know, you have to ask as the organization, what benefit does having a donor come to a village to view the work that they're funding? What benefit does that give to the community itself? What message does it send to community members around power and their role in the world as recipients of help rather than, you know, equal participants in life and community? And so I think the role of organizations that are stuck in this middle space is really to educate donors around this idea of decolonizing development and privilege, and actually going, well, you know, you can break it down to a purely economic argument. That money is better spent, you know, not flying overseas to visit a project. How much more good could you do with that money? And that goes back to Peter Singer's arguments around that, how we give and how we engage in giving. But I really think your question has highlighted a really big issue in how we look at doing good and how we position ourselves as good people. You know, there's a lot of people who aspire to be philanthropists because of the social status that brings. Yes, they want to do good. Yes, they're altruistic, but it does certainly bring a certain, a status. And part of that is to go and tour our organizations that we so benevolently fund. And you might think I'm being quite cynical, but I think this question is quite indicative of a much bigger problem.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that the whole narrative of decolonizing different aspects of how we engage with the world is such an important thing right now. And it's been really exciting. I mean, it's really interesting. Writing a book is a fascinating process in that I've finished writing the book a year ago. A lot has changed in the past year. A lot of conversations that were not being had in the mainstream have become mainstream. In the United States, with the Black Lives Matter movement, especially, a lot more conversations are happening around decolonization of different aspects of how we engage with the world. And the idea of people of power or privilege being able to purchase access to communities is a fundamentally deeply problematic concept that goes far beyond, as Leigh spoke to, volunteerism, that goes into every aspect of how we engage with other places. And I want to make sure that we have a chance to get to one more question, just because the hour's just about over. Speaking to Nathania, I have not heard of PCImedia.org or Congeno, and I feel a little embarrassed I haven't, because quickly looking them up, they're very, very cool and interesting. And I'm excited to learn more about them and different ways that people are telling stories, because I think that's a super important thing, that we also allow storytelling to not solely be the sort of platform of heritage media brands, and using the power of the internet to get more stories out there. But we have one more question around what would be a non-extractive engagement for school students, especially, that can facilitate a co-created positive and ethical experience. And I think the first thing I'd say to that is that everything we do is extractive. So non-extractive is itself not really the goal in my mind. It's about finding a greater equilibrium. So students, when they travel, will ultimately be taking something from somewhere. The question is, how much are they putting into that place? And the real deep flaw with volunteerism is, for a long time, the contribution that students especially were purportedly giving was labor and was physical action. And I would like to see more educational institutions who want their students to take part in these types of programs to reprioritize the investment of capital into communities. So that means that sleeping on a gym floor is not actually a way of helping a community. I've often spoken to college students who say, oh, but my volunteerism trip was okay because we didn't stay in a resort, we slept in a local gym. And that's just not true. That doesn't make sense to me. The way that we invest in places says a lot about what we think of them and how much we respect them. Hiring locals on the ground, not importing your staff. And if you cannot do it like that, if you cannot go somewhere without hiring locals and really prioritizing local experiences, don't go there. One of the biggest problems that we see in tourism is that people push forward with a destination because they have such a desire to go to a particular destination that they don't really care about how they have to do it. They're willing to sideline their different ethical priorities to get to that place. What are we teaching kids then? Like, what is the lesson that we are communicating if what we purport to believe and to prioritize is so quickly put secondary to an exotic experience?
Yeah. Can I just add quickly to that, Pippa? And this touches on, one of the closing remarks that follow on from your book. What is the future of volunteerism, right? And I think the future of volunteerism is particularly positive because we see the shift in tourist behavior, away from these kind of mass-produced experiences to the desire to want a curated experience, right? And this is kind of what we want students to have as well. So the shift towards more experiential rather than simply consuming a people and place is something that is going to be positive for volunteer tourism. You know, we now see people wanting to visit places and stay in places for a lot longer. So rather than just a 1 week all-inclusive holiday, they want to travel somewhere for a longer period, stay longer, and be local, right? And with these developments, I think volunteer tourism will take another step up because people have a desire for an experience rather than just to be in a place. So I think when it comes to this question about co-creating experiences, co-creating in theory sounds like a fantastic idea, but the question that has to be asked is to what extent does it perpetuate the very things that we are trying to retract from?
Yeah. This is one of my favorite subjects, school travel. You know, I always like to kind of frame it within that we're often presented as school trips are a chance for young people to check their privilege, for, you know, for them to become aware of and make changes. But what actually happens is that privilege is cemented. And often, you know, the idea of checking privilege is minimized to hard labor, moving bricks and cement and dirt around as a way to show that, you know, your life is so different from other people's. And that kind of plays into this concept of othering as well, which really cements privilege. To the question about what is a better way to do this? Because I think it's an important question. And while I'm very, very critical of school volunteerism trips, I'm not critical of travel for young people. I think it's really important. You know, putting aside, you know, responsible travel, but let's just talk about the importance of travel itself for young people. And that is crucial, I think, and it's a privilege, yes. But I think shifting away from the idea that we have to integrate service into youth or school travel trips is something that needs to have a lot more dialogue and thought around, because it's easy to just go, okay, we'll go and do a trek and then we'll add on a few days here as service, and that will make it a great trip and everyone will feel really good and satisfied. When actually what we should be doing is building in thematic learning throughout the whole trip. We should be learning about the history, the culture, the geography, the particular development challenges of the places and the people that we're going. And it should be integrated throughout the curriculum of the trip itself, not as an add-on. And that really means that there's pre-trip curriculum and post-trip curriculum. And that's how I think we move it slightly less away from the extraction side and more into positioning young people as learners, because that's what they are. That's their age and stage in life. We need to stop positioning them as helpers, because that is really going back to this idea of privilege and cementing that privilege. So yes, I could talk to you, Nikki, about that endlessly. Happy to talk offline too.
And I love sort of to close out the bit over an hour now. Leigh spoke to curriculum and to pre-trip education. And for me, a lot of people ask me, what are my hopes for the book? And this is the book. It's not that thick. It's not that intimidating. It's written so that it can be addressed chapter by chapter, so that a teacher or a trip leader or another educator could assign the chapters that are most applicable. And I hope that the book will be most useful to educators and to students as something that they engage with prior to taking part in what I hope to be more ethical means of traveling. prior to booking a trip, prior to getting their heart set on a certain way of traveling, so that they can begin to grapple with some of the questions that we've brought up here around privilege, around access, around what it means to go somewhere and to extract from a place and to exact change upon a place, because we change everywhere that we go, regardless of whether we put a shovel in the ground or we buy a souvenir. We are constantly changing things. And the question is what kind of change we're going to make. And to me, that is such a intimidating concept, but also such an empowering concept that we are entirely capable of, as humans, of doing better, because we've done it before. We've figured out ways of being better and of doing better and of being more respectful and of expecting more of ourselves. And this is just another place where we can do better, and we can expect more of ourselves, and we can expect more of others, and we can expect more of an industry. And especially when kids are concerned, both kids that are being impacted in communities and kids who want to go on a trip somewhere and have this idea of what it means to change the world, we can use hopefully books like ours to explore, and opportunities to engage with people like Leigh and Joseph, and these conversations as a way to show that we can change the world, but the ways in which we've been presented with doing it aren't the models to create the changes that we want to see. And so with that, I know there are still some questions in chat. I'm going to put my email in the chat. If anyone wants to email me questions directly, I really, really appreciate you guys for joining. I know we have people from all around the world who are able to tune in. And again, this is Ours to Explore: Privilege, Power, and the Paradox of Voluntourism. It's a hard read, but it's a fun read. And I've been told that by people other than myself. So I'm only minorly biased on that one. And I know Leigh just put her email in the chat as well. And I hope that people will get their hands on the book, will share it with others. And again, that it will be a learning tool as we all try to do better. Thank you guys all so much for joining.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Johnny. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting.